The letter trembled in Harriet Jenkins' hands, the teardrops that had fallen making the ink run in sad little rivers down the yellowed paper. She'd read it so many times that the creases were beginning to tear, yet she couldn't bring herself to put it away. This was all she had left of her fiancé, words penned in haste before he rode off to stake his claim in the Montana Territory, never to return. The stagecoach lurched as it hit a rut in the dusty road, jostling Harriet against the rough wooden seat. Spring of 1878 had brought little rain to this part of Wyoming, and the road was baked hard as iron. Outside the small window, the vast prairie stretched toward distant mountains, an ocean of grass swaying beneath the endless blue sky. "First time out west, miss?" The old woman sitting across from her smiled kindly, her face a road map of wrinkles and wisdom. Harriet folded the letter carefully, tucking it into her reticule. "Yes, madam, I'm bound for Silverleaf. Pretty little town, Silverleaf. Though I hear they've had trouble since the silver started running out." The woman studied Harriet's black traveling dress. "Visiting family?" "No," Harriet replied, her fingers unconsciously touching the letter through the fabric of her bag. "I've accepted a position as the schoolteacher." The truth was more complicated. After Thomas had died in a mining accident, leaving her with nothing but his last letter and promises of a life they'd never share, Harriet had been adrift. When the advertisement seeking a schoolteacher for the frontier town had appeared in the Philadelphia newspaper, it had seemed like fate. The stagecoach rolled into Silverleaf just as the afternoon sun began its descent behind the mountains. The town was smaller than Harriet had imagined, a single dusty main street lined with wooden buildings, their facades weathered by sun and wind. Men in work clothes and broad-brimmed hats moved between the general store and the saloon, while a few women hurried along the boardwalks, baskets tucked under their arms. "Silverleaf," the driver called out, pulling the team of horses to a stop in front of what appeared to be the only hotel. Harriet gathered her skirts and stepped down from the coach, accepting the driver's outstretched hand. Her legs felt wobbly after days of travel, and dust immediately coated her boots and the hem of her dress. "Miss Jenkins." A round-faced woman approached her, smiling broadly. "I'm Mrs. Olson, head of the school board. We've been so looking forward to your arrival." "Thank you for meeting me," Harriet said, returning the smile despite her exhaustion. "The schoolhouse isn't quite ready yet, needs a fresh coat of paint and some repairs to the roof. But we've arranged for you to stay at the Wilsons' boarding house until your accommodations at the schoolhouse are prepared." Mrs. Olson chattered on as they walked down the street, pointing out the church, the mercantile, and the sheriff's office. Harriet tried to pay attention, but her mind was foggy with fatigue, and her heart still ached with the weight of the letter in her reticule. The Wilsons' boarding house turned out to be a modest two-story building at the edge of town. Mrs. Wilson, a plump, energetic woman with flour perpetually dusting her apron, showed Harriet to a small but clean room on the second floor. "Supper's at 6, she informed Harriet. "The washroom is down the hall and there's fresh water in the pitcher." Alone at last, Harriet sank onto the narrow bed and pulled Thomas's letter from her bag. The familiar words blurred before her eyes as fresh tears formed. "My dearest Harriet, by the time you receive this, I will have reached the Montana Territory. The journey has been long, but thoughts of our future together have sustained me. I've heard tales of silver veins as thick as a man's arm, just waiting to be discovered. One good claim, my love, and we'll have enough to build that house by the sea you've always dreamed of." The letter continued with Thomas's plans and dreams, his promises to send for her once he'd made his fortune. But fate had other ideas. A cave-in at the mine had claimed his life just 2 weeks after he'd written the letter, leaving Harriet alone with nothing but paper memories. She was startled from her reverie by a knock at her door. Mrs. Wilson stood there with a steaming cup of tea. "Thought you might need this, dear. Long journey you've had." "Thank you," Harriet said, hastily wiping her eyes. Mrs. Wilson's gaze fell on the letter. "Bad news from home." "Old news," Harriet replied, carefully folding the paper. "My fiancé. He passed away last year in Montana." The older woman's face softened with sympathy. "I'm sorry, dear. Seems like the West takes more than it gives sometimes." She hesitated, then added, "Supper will be ready soon. Some hot food will do you good." Harriet nodded, grateful for the woman's kindness. After Mrs. Wilson left, she splashed water on her face and pinned up her dark hair, which had come loose during the journey. The face that looked back at her from the small mirror was pale and drawn, with shadows beneath her hazel eyes. At 24, she felt decades older than the carefree girl who had accepted Thomas's proposal 2 years ago. The dining room downstairs was already half full when Harriet descended. 4 men ranch hands by the look of their weather-beaten faces and calloused hands sat at one end of the long table, while an older couple occupied 2 chairs near the middle. Mrs. Wilson bustled about, setting down platters of fried chicken, potatoes, and biscuits. "Everyone, this is Miss Jenkins, our new schoolteacher," Mrs. Wilson announced. "Miss Jenkins, these are some of my regulars, the Parkers, and the boys from the Diamond M Ranch." The men nodded politely, and Mrs. Parker smiled warmly. "Welcome to Silverleaf, Miss Jenkins. We've been needing a proper teacher for some time now." Harriet took a seat beside Mrs. Parker, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. "I'm looking forward to meeting the children," she said, helping herself to a small portion of food, though her appetite had vanished. "Most of 'em are good kids," Mr. Parker said, "though young Billy Thompson might give you some trouble. Boy's wilder than a Mustang since his ma passed." The conversation flowed around her as the boarders discussed local affairs, the drought that threatened the cattle, the new shipment of goods expected at the mercantile, the upcoming town social. Harriet listened, grateful that no one seemed to expect much participation from her. Just as dessert was being served, a berry cobbler that smelled divine despite Harriet's lack of appetite, the front door opened, and a tall man stepped into the boarding house. Conversation halted as everyone turned to look at the newcomer. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with dust from the trail. His face was tanned and lean, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble. But it was his eyes that captured Harriet's attention, a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin. "Evening, folks," he said, his voice low and melodious. "Marshall Matthews," Mrs. Wilson exclaimed. "We weren't expecting you back for another week." "Got my business done quicker than anticipated," he replied, his gaze sweeping the table until it landed on Harriet. Something flickered in those blue eyes, curiosity, perhaps, or surprise at seeing a new face. "This is Miss Jenkins, our new schoolteacher," Mrs. Wilson said, noticing the direction of his gaze. "Miss Jenkins, this is Marshall Matthews. He runs the Diamond M Ranch just outside of town." Harriet nodded politely. "Mr. Matthews, Miss Jenkins." He inclined his head, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Welcome to Silverleaf." There was something about the way he looked at her, not with the usual male assessment she'd grown accustomed to in Philadelphia, but with a quiet intensity that made her feel as if he could see straight through to her heart. "Mrs. Wilson broke the moment by ushering Marshall to a seat and fetching him a plate. "You must be famished after your journey. Sit down and eat before everything gets cold." As conversation resumed around the table, Harriet found herself stealing glances at the rancher. He ate with the focused efficiency of a man accustomed to taking meals when he could, not when propriety dictated. His hands were large but moved with surprising grace as he cut his meat and buttered his biscuit. "Been teaching long, Miss Jenkins?" Marshall asked suddenly, catching her watching him. Harriet flushed, embarrassed at being caught staring. "This will be my first position, actually. I tutored in Philadelphia, but this is my first school. Brave of you to come all this way for a job," he commented. "Most Eastern ladies wouldn't consider it." "I needed a change," she said simply, unwilling to share the real reason for her journey west with a stranger. He seemed to sense her reticence and nodded, turning his attention back to his meal. But throughout the remainder of dinner, Harriet felt his gaze on her more than once, curious and assessing. After dinner, pleading fatigue from her journey, Harriet excused herself and returned to her room. The letter was where she'd left it on the bedside table. She picked it up, running her fingers over Thomas's handwriting, feeling the familiar ache in her chest. Outside her window, the vast Wyoming sky had deepened to indigo, studded with stars brighter and more numerous than she'd ever seen in Philadelphia. She hadn't come west to find love again. She'd come to escape the pitying glances, the well-meaning but painful questions, the constant reminders of what she'd lost. Teaching in a frontier town seemed as good a way as any to start anew. Yet as she drifted off to sleep that night, it wasn't Thomas's face that flashed behind her eyelids, but the startling blue eyes of Marshall Matthews. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with the promise of heat to come. Harriet dressed in one of her simpler dresses, a navy blue cotton with white collar and cuffs, and pinned her hair in a neat bun at the nape of her neck. Today, she would see the schoolhouse for the first time and begin preparing for her students. Mrs. Olson arrived after breakfast to escort her. "It's not far," she assured Harriet as they set off down the dusty Main Street. "Just past the church." The schoolhouse stood on a small rise at the edge of town, a simple white wooden structure with a bell tower and a small covered porch. Inside, it was a single room with rows of desks facing a larger desk and blackboard. Sunshine streamed through the windows, illuminating dancing dust motes. "It needs a woman's touch," Mrs. Olson admitted, "but it's sturdy." The living quarters are through that door at the back: a bedroom, sitting room, and small kitchen. There's an outhouse behind the building and a pump for water. Harriet walked slowly around the room, trying to imagine it filled with children. "How many students will I have?" "About 20, ranging from 6 to 16. Some of the ranch children can only attend when farm work allows, especially during planting and harvest." They spent the morning discussing the curriculum and the town's expectations. Harriet would be expected to teach reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and geography to all ages. The older girls might also receive instruction in needlework and etiquette, while the boys could learn practical mathematics for farming and business. "The town social is this Saturday," Mrs. Olson said as they prepared to leave. "It would be a good opportunity for you to meet the families of your students before school begins next Monday." "I'll be there," Harriet promised, though the thought of socializing with so many strangers made her stomach knot with anxiety. As they stepped outside, Harriet noticed a rider approaching on a magnificent chestnut horse. Her heart gave an unexpected flutter when she recognized Marshall Matthews. He rode with the ease of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle, his broad shoulders relaxed, one hand resting lightly on his thigh. "Good morning, ladies," he called as he drew closer, tipping his hat. "Marshall, what brings you to town so early, Mrs. Olson asked, beaming at him with obvious fondness. "Had some business with the blacksmith," he replied, dismounting with fluid grace. His gaze shifted to Harriet. "Miss Jenkins, I trust you slept well after your journey." "Yes, thank you," she said, uncomfortably aware of the warmth creeping into her cheeks under his steady gaze. I see Mrs. Olson is showing you the schoolhouse, he continued, looking past her to the white building. It's been empty too long. The children need proper schooling. Do you have children, Mr. Matthews? Harriet asked, immediately regretting the personal nature of the question. Something flickered in his eyes, amusement perhaps, or surprise at her directness. No, Miss Jenkins. I've never had the pleasure of marriage or fatherhood. My ranch keeps me too busy for such luxuries. He paused, then added with a slight smile, but I was a boy once, and I know the value of education. My foreman's children will be among your students. Mrs. Olson, who had been watching this exchange with undisguised interest, suddenly exclaimed, "Oh, I've just remembered I promised to help Mrs. Wilson with the mending this afternoon. Marshall, would you be so kind as to escort Miss Jenkins back to the boarding house? I'd hate for her to get lost." Before Harriet could protest that the town was hardly large enough to get lost in, Marshall had agreed. "It would be my pleasure, Mrs. Olson." And so Harriet found herself walking beside the tall rancher, acutely conscious of his presence. Up close, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, laugh lines. Her mother would have called them, and a small scar that bisected his right eyebrow. "Have you always lived in Wyoming, Mr. Matthews?" she asked, desperate to break the silence. "I came west from Missouri after the war," he replied. "Worked as a drover for a few years, then as a ranch foreman. Bought my own place about 8 years ago." "The war," Harriet repeated, doing the mental calculation. If he'd fought in the Civil War, he must be older than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his late 30s. "I was young," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "Lied about my age to enlist. 16 when I joined up, 19 when it ended. Saw things no boy should see." His voice had taken on a distant quality, as if he were speaking from far away. Harriet nodded, understanding his reluctance to elaborate. The war had ended 13 years ago, but its shadows still lingered across the nation. "And you, Miss Jenkins? What brought you all the way from Philadelphia to our little corner of Wyoming?" Marshall asked, changing the subject. Harriet hesitated. The letter in her reticule seemed to burn against her hip, a physical reminder of her loss. "I wanted adventure," she said finally. "It wasn't entirely a lie." Marshall's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Well, you've certainly come to the right place for that. Wyoming has adventure to spare, though not always the kind Eastern ladies might have in mind." They had reached the boarding house, and Harriet turned to thank him for the escort. Standing on the bottom step of the porch, her eyes were almost level with his. "I hope you'll attend the town social on Saturday," he said, his blue eyes intent on her face. "It would be a shame if Silverleaf's newest resident missed the event of the season." "I'll be there," Harriet replied, surprised by the flutter of anticipation in her stomach. He nodded, satisfied, and replaced his hat. "Until Saturday, then, Miss Jenkins." She watched him stride away, his long legs eating up the distance as he headed toward the blacksmith shop at the end of the street. There was something compelling about Marshall Matthews, a quiet strength that drew her despite her best intentions to keep her heart safely guarded. Inside her room, Harriet took out Thomas's letter once more, tracing the familiar words with her fingertip. For the first time, she noticed that the pain of reading it had diminished slightly, like a wound beginning to heal. "I'm sorry, Thomas," she whispered to the empty room. "I didn't come here to forget you, but perhaps I need to learn how to remember you without letting grief consume me." The days leading up to the social passed in a blur of activity. Harriet spent most of her time at the schoolhouse, cleaning and organizing, preparing lesson plans, and arranging her few personal belongings in the living quarters at the back. Some of the town's women brought curtains for the windows and fresh linens for her bed. Mr. Parker, who turned out to be a skilled carpenter, fixed the wobbly floorboards and repaired a broken desk. By Saturday evening, Harriet felt as ready as she could be for both the social and the start of school. She dressed carefully in her best gown, a deep green silk that brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. It was perhaps more formal than the occasion warranted, but it gave her confidence to face an evening of meeting new people. Mrs. Wilson whistled appreciatively when Harriet descended the stairs. "My, don't you look lovely? Every unmarried man in Silverleaf will be vying for a dance." Harriet blushed. "I'm not looking for a husband, Mrs. Wilson. I came here to teach." The older woman's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Of course, dear. But teaching and marriage aren't mutually exclusive, you know. Why, our last teacher, Miss Collins, married the blacksmith after only 6 months in town." The town hall, normally used for meetings and court sessions, had been transformed for the occasion. Paper lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the proceedings. A small group of musicians, a fiddler, a banjo player, and an accordionist were setting up on a small stage at one end of the room. Mrs. Olson immediately took charge of Harriet, leading her around the room and introducing her to what felt like every resident of Silverleaf and the surrounding area. Names and faces blurred together, mothers concerned about their children's education, fathers inquiring about the curriculum, and, as Mrs. Wilson had predicted, several unmarried men who seemed inordinately interested in the new schoolteacher. Harriet kept glancing toward the door, telling herself she wasn't looking for anyone in particular. But when Marshall Matthews finally appeared, dressed in a clean shirt and dark trousers, his hair damp and combed back from his forehead, her heart gave a traitorous leap. He spotted her almost immediately, his blue eyes finding her across the crowded room. With a nod to someone he'd been speaking with, he made his way toward her. "Miss Jenkins," he said, taking her hand briefly. "You look lovely this evening." "Thank you, Mr. Matthews," she replied, hoping the dim lighting concealed the blush warming her cheeks. "I hope you'll save a dance for me," he said, his voice low and meant only for her ears. Before she could respond, Mrs. Olson whisked her away to meet the minister's wife, and by the time that conversation ended, the dancing had begun. Harriet found herself partnered with the young deputy sheriff for the first dance, a lively reel that left her breathless and laughing. Several dances later, as she stood by the refreshment table sipping punch, she felt a presence at her elbow. Marshall stood there, his expression unreadable in the flickering lantern light. "I believe you promised me a dance, Miss Jenkins," he said, extending his hand. "Did I?" she asked, a teasing note entering her voice. "I don't recall making any promises, Mr. Matthews." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his serious expression. "Then, would you do me the honor of this dance?" The musicians had begun a waltz, slower and more intimate than the previous dances. Harriet hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. His palm was warm and calloused against her fingers as he led her to the dance floor. Marshall proved to be an excellent dancer, guiding her through the steps with confident ease. His hand at her waist was respectful but firm, maintaining the proper distance between them even as Harriet found herself wishing he might hold her closer. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Matthews," she said as they turned. "I wouldn't have expected a rancher to be so accomplished at dancing." "My mother insisted that all her sons learn," he replied, his eyes never leaving her face. "She said a man should be as comfortable in a ballroom as he is on the range." A wise woman. "She was," he agreed, a shadow crossing his face. "She passed during the war while I was away fighting." "I'm sorry," Harriet said softly, understanding all too well the pain of losing someone while separated by distance. They danced in silence for a moment, the music swelling around them. Other couples moved in a circle around the floor, but to Harriet, it felt as if she and Marshall were alone in their own private world. "You never did tell me the real reason you came west," he said suddenly, his voice low. Harriet looked up at him, startled by the directness of his question. Something in his blue eyes, not just curiosity, but genuine interest, made her want to tell him the truth. "My fiancé died," she said, the words feeling strange on her tongue. She'd hardly spoken of Thomas to anyone since his death. "He came west to make his fortune in the silver mines of Montana. He died in a cave-in before I could join him." Marshall's hand tightened slightly on hers, not pity, but a gesture of understanding. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Jenkins." "Thank you," she said simply. "Is that why you chose to come to Wyoming, to be closer to where he was?" Harriet shook her head. "No, I needed to leave Philadelphia. Everything there reminded me of him, of the life we had planned together." She hesitated, then added, "I still have his last letter. I read it sometimes when I need to remember his voice." The music ended and Marshall released her, though he seemed reluctant to break their connection. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Jenkins," he said formally, but his eyes conveyed much more. As the evening wore on, Harriet danced with several other men, but her thoughts kept returning to Marshall. He moved through the crowd with easy confidence, speaking with various townspeople, occasionally joining in the dancing with other partners. Yet whenever she looked up, she often found his gaze already on her. The social ended well past midnight, with families with young children having departed hours earlier. Mrs. Wilson was deep in conversation with the minister and his wife, showing no signs of leaving soon. "May I walk you back to the boarding house?" Marshall's voice came from behind Harriet, startling her. She turned to find him standing close, his hat already in his hands. "That would be kind, thank you." The night air was cool after the warmth of the town hall, and Harriet shivered slightly in her thin evening dress. Without a word, Marshall removed his coat and draped it around her shoulders. It was warm from his body and carried his scent, leather, soap, and something distinctly masculine that made her heart race. "I don't want to take your coat," she protested weakly, even as she pulled it closer around her. "I'm used to the cold," he said simply. "Wyoming winters are harsh teachers." They walked in companionable silence for a while, the sounds of their footsteps on the wooden sidewalk and the distant howl of a coyote, the only noises breaking the stillness of the night. "I enjoyed our dance," Marshall said at last, his voice soft in the darkness. "And our conversation." "As did I," Harriet admitted. They had reached the boarding house, and Harriet reluctantly removed his coat, immediately missing its warmth and his scent. "Thank you for the escort, Mr. Matthews," she said formally, suddenly shy. "Marshall," he corrected gently. "I'd like it if you called me Marshall, at least when we're not in formal company." Harriet smiled, feeling a flutter of something that might have been happiness, a sensation she'd almost forgotten. "Then you must call me Harriet." "Harriet," he repeated, as if testing the sound of her name on his tongue. "Good night, Harriet. I wish you well with your first day of teaching on Monday." "Good night, Marshall." He waited until she was safely inside before turning away, and Harriet watched through the window as he walked back toward the hitching post where his horse waited patiently. There was something about the straight set of his shoulders, the confident stride, that made her want to know more about this man who danced as well as he rode and spoke of his mother with such tenderness. In her room, she took out Thomas's letter one last time before bed. The words were as familiar as her own heartbeat, but tonight they felt different, somehow less like an open wound and more like the memory of one. Monday morning dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for the first day of school. Harriet had moved into the schoolhouse quarters the previous day, arranging her few possessions to make the simple rooms feel like home. Now, As she stood on the porch ringing the bell to summon her students, she felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The children began arriving in ones and twos. Some walked from homes in town. Others rode in on horseback or came in wagons with their parents. They regarded their new teacher with expressions ranging from curiosity to wariness to outright defiance, particularly from a lanky boy who must be the Billy Thompson that Mr. Parker had mentioned. "Good morning, children," Harriet said, trying to keep her voice steady as 20 pairs of eyes stared back at her. "I'm Miss Jenkins, and I'm very excited to be your teacher." The morning passed in a blur of introductions, assessments, and establishing routines. Harriet discovered that some of the older children had received little formal education, while others showed remarkable aptitude despite the irregular nature of their previous schooling. Billy Thompson, as predicted, tested her authority at every turn, but she met his challenges with firm kindness that seemed to confuse him more than anger him. By midday, when she rang the bell for the lunch break, Harriet felt more confident. The children spilled out into the schoolyard, unwrapping packages of food brought from home. Harriet sat on the porch steps with her own simple lunch, watching them play and trying to memorize names and faces. A movement at the edge of the schoolyard caught her attention. Marshall sat astride his chestnut horse, watching the children at play. When he saw Harriet had noticed him, he urged his mount forward, stopping at the edge of the steps. "How goes the battle, Miss Jenkins?" he asked, his blue eyes twinkling with amusement. "Quite well, I think, Mr. Matthews," she replied, mindful of the proper formality required in front of her students, "though I suspect some skirmishes lie ahead." His gaze shifted to where Billy Thompson was showing younger boys how to use a slingshot. "That one in particular, I'd wager." "He's testing my boundaries," Harriet said. "It's to be expected." Marshall nodded, his expression thoughtful. "His father's not much help, drinks too much since his wife died. Boy practically raises himself." "I suspected as much," Harriet said softly. "Children who act out are often the ones who need the most care, not the most discipline." Marshall looked at her with new respect in his eyes. "You're wiser than your years suggest, Miss Jenkins." Harriet smiled, feeling a warm glow at his approval. "What brings you to the schoolhouse today, Mr. Matthews? Surely not just to check on my teaching methods." "I was on my way back from the telegraph office and thought I'd see how your first day was progressing," he admitted, "and to invite you to dinner at my ranch this Sunday after church. Mrs. Reynolds, my housekeeper, has been pestering me to invite company. She says I've become too accustomed to my own silence." The invitation surprised Harriet. A private dinner at his ranch seemed far more intimate than a dance at a public social. I'm not sure that would be appropriate, Mr. Matthews. People might talk." "Mrs. Reynolds will be there as chaperone," he assured her, "and my foreman and his wife. It's not an intimate dinner, Miss Jenkins, merely a neighborly welcome." Put that way, it seemed churlish to refuse. "Then I would be delighted to accept." The lunch break was ending and the children were beginning to gather at the schoolhouse steps. Marshall tipped his hat to her. "Until Sunday, then. Good luck with your afternoon lessons." The remainder of the week passed in a whirlwind of teaching, planning, and settling into her new life. Harriet found herself enjoying the challenges of the classroom more than she had anticipated. Even Billy Thompson showed signs of responding to her patient approach, though he still tested her at every opportunity. Each night, she fell into bed exhausted but satisfied with the day's work. And if her dreams were increasingly filled with blue eyes and a slow smile, she tried not to dwell on it in her waking hours. Sunday arrived with a sense of anticipation that Harriet tried to attribute to professional curiosity about one of the largest ranches in the area. She wore her second-best dress to church, a deep blue that brought out the color in her eyes, and was pleasantly surprised when Marshall appeared at her side after the service. "My buggy is just outside," he said, offering his arm. "Unless you'd prefer to ride." "The buggy will be fine, thank you," Harriet replied, placing her hand lightly on his sleeve. Several townspeople noticed their departure together, and Harriet saw Mrs. Wilson exchange a significant glance with Mrs. Olson. News traveled fast in small towns, and she had no doubt that by tomorrow, everyone in Silverleaf would know that the new schoolteacher had gone to dinner at the Diamond M Ranch. The ranch was about 5 miles outside of town, set in a lush valley with a creek running through it. The main house was larger than Harriet had expected, a 2-story structure built of logs and local stone, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely as Marshall handed her down from the buggy. "Thank you," he replied, a note of pride in his voice. "I built most of it myself, with help from my men during the slow seasons." The interior was a pleasant surprise, comfortable but tasteful, with good furniture and colorful rugs covering the polished wooden floors. Mrs. Reynolds, a motherly woman with iron-gray hair and kind eyes, welcomed Harriet warmly. "The master has told me all about the new schoolteacher," she said, taking Harriet's shawl. "It's about time we had someone to properly educate the children." Dinner was served in a dining room dominated by a large oak table that could easily seat 12. Today, there were only 5 places set for Harriet, Marshall, Mrs. Reynolds, and Jake and Sarah Cooper, Marshall's foreman, and his wife. The conversation flowed easily, focused primarily on ranch business, the town's affairs, and Harriet's impressions of Silverleaf after her first week. "Your boys are doing well in school," Harriet told Sarah Cooper. "Tommy has a real aptitude for mathematics, and Jimmy's reading has improved significantly just in this first week." Sarah beamed with motherly pride. "They've been talking about you non-stop, Miss Jenkins. Tommy says you don't whip them for every little mistake like the last teacher did." "I believe children learn better through encouragement than fear," Harriet replied, catching Marshall's approving nod from the head of the table. After dinner, while the others retired to the parlor for coffee, Marshall invited Harriet to see the rest of the ranch. They walked together through the barn, where he showed her his prize horses, then out to a small rise overlooking the valley. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. Cattle dotted the distant pastures, and the creek sparkled like a ribbon of fire in the fading light. "It's the most beautiful place I've ever seen," Harriet said, turning to find Marshall watching her rather than the view. "I thought the same thing when I first saw this valley," he said quietly. "I'd been drifting since the war, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. But when I rode through here, I knew I'd found home." Something in his voice, a longing that echoed her own, made Harriet's heart ache. "You've built something remarkable here. It's a good life," he agreed. "Though sometimes a lonely one." Their eyes met, and Harriet felt a connection that went beyond mere attraction, a recognition of kindred spirits who understood loss and loneliness. The moment was broken by the sound of hoofbeats approaching rapidly. Jake Cooper appeared on a lathered horse, his expression grim. "Boss, there's trouble at the north pasture. Rustlers hit the herd. They've taken at least 30 head, maybe more." Marshall's demeanor changed instantly, the contemplative man replaced by a decisive leader. "Get the men together. We'll ride out immediately." He turned to Harriet, regret in his eyes. "I'm sorry to cut our evening short." "Of course," she said, understanding the urgency. "Please be careful," he nodded, already moving toward the barn. "Jake, have Mrs. Cooper drive Miss Jenkins back to town." And just like that, the magical evening was over. Sarah Cooper was apologetic as she drove Harriet back to Silverleaf in the gathering darkness. "Rustling's been getting worse lately. The drought's made everyone desperate. Will they be in danger?" Harriet couldn't help asking, her thoughts on Marshall riding out into the night to confront men willing to steal cattle. "Marshall knows what he's doing," Sarah assured her. "He was a lawman for a while before he bought the ranch, and he has good men with him." But as Harriet lay in her narrow bed at the schoolhouse that night, she couldn't help worrying. The letter from Thomas that had been her constant companion since his death lay on her bedside table, but for the first time, she didn't reach for it. Instead, her thoughts were filled with concern for a very different man, one who was very much alive and possibly in danger. 3 days passed with no word from the Diamond M Ranch. Harriet tried to focus on her teaching, but worry gnawed at her. Had Marshall been hurt? Were the rustlers still at large? The questions circled in her mind, distracting her during lessons and keeping her awake at night. On Wednesday afternoon, just as school was dismissing, the sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. Marshall dismounted outside the schoolhouse, his face grim beneath the dust of the trail. He waited patiently while the children scattered, some pausing to stare at the imposing rancher before running off. "Mr. Matthews," Harriet said, relief washing over her. "You're safe, Miss Jenkins." He removed his hat, revealing hair flattened with sweat and trail dust. "I apologize for not sending word sooner. We've been tracking the rustlers since Sunday night." "Did you find them?" she asked, gesturing for him to join her on the schoolhouse porch. "We recovered most of the cattle," he said, settling wearily onto the bench beside her. "But the men got away. For now." Harriet studied his face, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the lines of exhaustion etched around his mouth. "You look like you haven't slept in days." "I haven't," he admitted. "Not properly, at least. Would you like some coffee?" she offered. "Or tea? I was just about to make some for myself." Marshall hesitated, then nodded. "Coffee would be welcome, thank you." Harriet led him through the schoolroom to her private quarters, acutely aware that inviting a man into her home could be considered improper. But Marshall looked dead on his feet, and she couldn't bear to send him away without at least offering some refreshment. "Please, sit," she said, gesturing to the small table in her kitchen area while she busied herself with the stove and coffee pot. Marshall sank into a chair, removing his gloves and placing them beside his hat on the table. In the close confines of the kitchen, Harriet was newly aware of his size, the breadth of his shoulders, the length of his legs stretched out before him. "I wanted to apologize properly for our interrupted evening," he said, as she placed a steaming cup of coffee before him. "It wasn't how I'd planned to end our dinner." "There's no need to apologize," Harriet assured him, taking the seat opposite. "I understand that ranch emergencies don't wait for convenient moments." He wrapped his hands around the cup, seeming to draw strength from its warmth. "Nevertheless, I'd like to make it up to you. Perhaps another dinner when things are more settled." Harriet hesitated, torn between propriety and the undeniable pull she felt toward this man. "I'm not sure that would be wise, Mr. Matthews." "Marshall," he corrected gently. "And why not wise?" "I'm the town's schoolteacher," she reminded him. "I'm expected to maintain a certain reputation. Dining alone with an unmarried man would cause talk." "And if we weren't alone?" he asked, his blue eyes intent on her face. "The town picnic is next weekend. Would you accompany me to that?" A public event seemed safer, less likely to cause gossip. "Yes, I think that would be acceptable." They talked for nearly an hour, the conversation flowing easily between them. Marshall told her more about the ranch, about his dreams of expanding it further, perhaps adding sheep to his cattle operation despite the traditional animosity between sheep and cattle ranchers. Harriet shared stories of her students, their progress and challenges, her hopes for organizing a small library for the town. When Marshall finally rose to leave, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the schoolyard. At the door he paused, his hat in his hands. "Thank you for the coffee, Harriet," he said softly, "and for the company. It's been a long time since I've enjoyed conversation as much as I do with you." Before she could respond, he leaned down and pressed his lips to her cheek, the briefest touch that nevertheless sent warmth flooding through her. "Until the picnic," he said, settling his hat on his head and striding toward his waiting horse. Harriet touched her cheek where his lips had been, her heart racing. This was dangerous territory. She had come west to escape the memories of one man, not to lose her heart to another. Yet as she watched Marshall ride away, she couldn't deny the lightness in her chest, the feeling that something dormant within her was beginning to awaken. That night, for the first time since arriving in Silverleaf, she didn't read Thomas's letter before sleeping. Instead, she placed it in a drawer, a tacit acknowledgement that perhaps it was time to start letting go of the past. The days leading up to the town picnic passed in a flurry of activity. In addition to her regular teaching duties, Harriet found herself helping to organize games for the children and contributing to the planning committee. The entire town seemed to be in a festive mood, anticipating the first major community event since the social. The day of the picnic dawned sunny and mild, perfect weather for an outdoor gathering. Harriet dressed with special care in a pretty calico dress with a matching bonnet, her heart fluttering with anticipation at the thought of seeing Marshall again. He arrived at the schoolhouse precisely at noon, driving a smart buggy pulled by a matched pair of bays. "You look lovely," he said as he helped her into the seat. The picnic was being held in a meadow just outside town, near the river that gave Silverleaf its name. Tables had been set up under the cottonwood trees, laden with food contributed by the townspeople. Children ran about playing games, while adults gathered in small groups, talking and laughing. Harriet was immediately swept into a circle of the other women, who plied her with questions about the school and her impressions of Silverleaf. Marshall was similarly absorbed into a group of men discussing cattle prices and the persistent drought. But throughout the afternoon, their eyes kept finding each other across the meadow, and each glance felt like a private conversation. After the meal, there were organized games, three-legged races for the children, horseshoe pitching for the men, and a cake walk for everyone. As the afternoon waned, someone produced a fiddle and impromptu dancing began on a flat area near the riverbank. Marshall found Harriet sitting with Mrs. Olson, watching the dancing. "Would you care to join them?" he asked, extending his hand. The music was a lively reel, and several couples were already twirling about. Harriet placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her into the dance. They moved together as if they'd been dancing partners for years, his hand at her waist guiding her through the steps, her body responding naturally to his lead. "You're drawing attention," he murmured as they turned, nodding subtly toward where Mrs. Wilson and several other town matrons were watching them with undisguised interest. "Is that a problem?" Harriet asked, suddenly self-conscious. Marshall's hand tightened slightly at her waist. "Not for me. I'm not concerned with gossip, but if it troubles you." "It doesn't," she decided, surprising herself with the realization. "I'm enjoying myself too much to care what anyone thinks." The smile that spread across his face was worth any amount of gossip. As the music changed to a slower tune, he drew her slightly closer, still maintaining propriety but reducing the space between them enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. "I've been thinking about you," he admitted, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "More than is probably wise." Harriet's heart skipped a beat. "I've been thinking about you too. I know it hasn't been long since you arrived in Silverleaf," Marshall continued, his blue eyes serious. "And I understand that you're still healing from your loss. But I'd like your permission to court you properly, Harriet Jenkins." The directness of his request took her breath away. "Marshall, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to answer now," he assured her. "Take all the time you need. I'm a patient man." The music ended and they stood for a moment, still connected by their joined hands, the world around them fading into insignificance. Then someone called Marshall's name, breaking the spell, and they stepped apart. The remainder of the picnic passed in a blur for Harriet. She participated in conversations, helped serve dessert, and even joined in a game of croquet, but her mind kept returning to Marshall's words. Was she ready to open her heart again? Did she even know how, after closing it so tightly following Thomas's death? As the sun began to set, families started packing up to return home. Marshall found Harriet helping to gather the remaining food from the tables. "May I drive you back to the schoolhouse?" he asked, his manner now carefully formal, as if he feared he'd overstepped earlier. "Yes, thank you," she replied, suddenly shy with him. The drive back to town was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the schoolhouse, Marshall helped her down from the buggy, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "I meant what I said earlier," he said softly. "I'll wait for your answer however long it takes." "Thank you for understanding," Harriet replied. "It's not that I don't care for you, it's just you need time," he finished for her. "I understand truly." As she watched him drive away, Harriet felt torn between exhilaration and terror. Marshall Matthews was offering her a second chance at happiness, at love. But accepting it meant letting go of the past, of the comfortable grief she'd wrapped around herself like a protective cloak. Inside her quarters, Harriet retrieved Thomas's letter from the drawer where she'd placed it. The paper was growing thin at the creases, the ink fading in places from being handled so often. She read it once more, each word familiar as her own reflection. "I'll write you something better when I'm settled, my love. Tales of mountains taller than you could imagine, of forests that stretch forever, of skies so wide and blue they make a man feel small and large all at once. And when I've made my fortune, I'll send for you, and we'll build our life together in this wild, beautiful land." Tears filled her eyes, but they were different now, not the raw grief of fresh loss, but a gentler sadness for what might have been. Thomas had wanted her to find happiness in the West, though he'd imagined it would be with him. Could she honor his memory by finding joy with someone else? Harriet carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the drawer. She didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time she could imagine a future that wasn't defined by her past. The following weeks brought a rhythm to Harriet's life in Silverleaf. Her days were filled with teaching, and she found genuine satisfaction in watching her students' progress. Billy Thompson, in particular, had begun to show real improvement, his initial defiance gradually replaced by a grudging respect for his teacher's patience and fairness. Marshall was true to his word about courting her properly. He called at the schoolhouse each Sunday after church, sometimes to invite her for a drive, other times bringing small gifts, a book he thought she might enjoy, wildflowers gathered from the prairie, or once, a beautiful quill pen carved from an eagle feather by one of his ranch hands. Their conversations during these outings ranged widely from books they had both read to their differing experiences of the war. He as a young soldier, she as a child in Philadelphia. From his plans for the ranch to her dreams of expanding educational opportunities in Silverleaf. With each meeting, Harriet felt herself drawing closer to him, her initial wariness giving way to genuine affection and, increasingly, to something deeper, Yet still she hesitated to give him the answer he sought. The letter in her drawer remained a tangible link to Thomas, to the life she had planned before fate intervened. Could she truly let it go? One evening in late May, Harriet was grading papers when a knock sounded at her door. Surprised by the late visitor, it was well past 8 o'clock. She approached cautiously. "Who is it?" she called through the door. "It's Marshall," came the reply. "I apologize for the hour, but it's important." She opened the door to find him standing on her porch, his expression grave. "What's wrong?" "It's Billy Thompson," he said. "His father's been on a 3-day drunk and the boys run away. Left a note saying he was heading for the hills to live like a mountain man, with the storm coming in." He gestured toward the darkening sky where clouds were building ominously. Harriet's heart clenched with worry. "I'll get my coat." "You don't have to come," Marshall began, but she was already reaching for her shawl. "He's my student, Marshall. I'm coming." They rode double on Marshall's horse, Harriet seated before him in the saddle, his arms around her as he handled the reins. Under other circumstances, the intimacy of their position might have caused her embarrassment, but her concern for Billy overshadowed all else. Where would he go? She asked as they rode away from town. Did his note give any clues? Just that he was heading for the hills. But Jake Cooper mentioned seeing a boy matching Billy's description near the old mining camp earlier today. It's a start. The abandoned mining camp lay about 5 miles from town, a collection of dilapidated shacks and collapsed tunnels left over from a short-lived silver strike 10 years earlier. As they approached, the first fat raindrops began to fall, and thunder rumbled in the distance. "Billy," Marshall called, his voice carrying in the still air before the storm. "Billy Thompson." No answer came. They dismounted, and Marshall tied his horse to a post outside what had once been the assay office. "We'll need to search the buildings. Stay close, these structures aren't stable." They moved from shack to shack, calling Billy's name, checking dark corners and collapsed doorways. The rain was falling steadily now, and Harriet's thin shawl provided little protection against the growing chill. "There," she said suddenly, pointing to a flicker of light in a building at the far end of the camp. "I saw something." They hurried toward it, careful of their footing on the rain-slicked ground. The building had once been a bunkhouse for the miners, its roof now partially collapsed, its windows long since broken. Marshall pushed open the sagging door, and they found Billy huddled near a small fire he'd built in what remained of the stone fireplace. The boy looked up, his expression a mixture of defiance and relief. "Go away," he said, his voice cracking. "I ain't going back." Harriet moved forward slowly, keeping her voice gentle. "Billy, we've been worried about you." "With the storm coming, don't care," the boy interrupted, though his bravado was belied by the way he hugged his knees to his chest. "I can take care of myself." "I'm sure you can," Marshall said, his tone matter of fact. But even experienced mountain men don't stay in buildings that might collapse on their heads during a storm. As if to emphasize his point, a loud crack of thunder shook the building, and rain began to pour through the holes in the roof. Billy flinched, his young face suddenly vulnerable. "Your father's worried sick," Harriet said, though she suspected it wasn't entirely true. From what she'd gathered, Billy's father was more likely passed out drunk than searching for his son. "No, he ain't," Billy replied with the brutal honesty of children. "He don't even notice when I'm there, 'cept to yell at me or worse." Harriet's heart ached for the boy. She knelt beside him, uncaring of the dirt on the floor. "I notice, Billy, I notice when you're not in school. I notice when you do well on your lessons. I notice when you're kind to the younger children, even though you pretend not to be." The boy's eyes filled with tears that he stubbornly refused to let fall. "You're just saying that 'cause you're the teacher. It's your job." It's my job to teach you reading and arithmetic, Harriet corrected gently. It's my choice to care about you. A particularly violent gust of wind hit the building, and the remaining portion of the roof groaned ominously. Marshall stepped forward, decision made. We need to leave now, he said firmly. This place isn't safe. Billy, you can come willingly or I can carry you out, but either way, you're coming with us. The boy looked as if he might argue, but another crash of thunder changed his mind. Fine, he muttered, getting to his feet. But I ain't going home. We'll figure something out, Marshall promised, guiding both Harriet and Billy toward the door. For tonight, you can stay at my ranch. We'll sort the rest out tomorrow. The ride back to the Diamond M was harrowing. The storm had intensified, with lightning splitting the sky and rain falling in sheets. They traveled slowly, Marshall's horse picking its way carefully along the muddy trail, Billy seated in front of him and Harriet behind, her arms wrapped around Marshall's waist. By the time they reached the ranch, all three were soaked to the skin and chilled to the bone. Mrs. Reynolds took one look at them and sprang into action, ordering hot baths and dry clothes for everyone. Billy was whisked away to be tended to, while Marshall showed Harriet to a guest room where a hot bath and a borrowed nightgown from Mrs. Reynolds awaited her. I'll have your clothes dried by morning, Marshall told her at the door. Try to get some rest. You were amazing with Billy. So were you, she replied, touched by the genuine concern he'd shown for the boy. Thank you for not being angry with him. The boy needs guidance, not punishment, Marshall said simply, something I suspect his father has never understood. After her bath, Harriet wrapped herself in the voluminous nightgown and the warm robe Mrs. Reynolds had provided. Though exhausted, she found herself too keyed up to sleep. The storm still raged outside, rattling the windows and howling around the eaves of the house. A soft knock sounded at her door. Thinking it might be Mrs. Reynolds checking on her, Harriet called, "Come in." But it was Marshall who entered, also dressed in a robe over what appeared to be sleep clothes. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said, remaining near the door. "I wanted to make sure you were comfortable." "Yes, thank you," she replied, suddenly conscious of the intimacy of the situation, both of them in night clothes, alone in her bedroom. But the propriety that should have made her ask him to leave seemed unimportant after the events of the night. "How is Billy?" she asked instead. "Asleep, finally. Mrs. Reynolds filled him with hot soup and warm milk with honey. He'll be out until morning, I expect." Harriet nodded, relieved. "What will happen to him? His father is not fit to care for a child," Marshall finished, his expression grim. "I've had concerns about the situation for some time. Tonight might be the catalyst needed for intervention. You think the court would remove him from his father's care? With the right advocate, yes." Marshall hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking of taking him on at the ranch. Not as a ward exactly, but as an apprentice of sorts. He's of an age where he could learn ranching if he's interested, and he'd have a proper home, meals, education." Harriet's heart swelled with affection for this man who, beneath his reserved exterior, had such capacity for compassion. "That's a wonderful idea, Marshall. I think he'd thrive here." A particularly loud crack of thunder made them both jump, and then the lamp in Harriet's room flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness broken only by flashes of lightning through the window. "I should go," Marshall said, his voice low in the darkness. "It wouldn't do for me to be found here if the lamps come back on." But neither of them moved. In the next flash of lightning, Harriet could see him watching her, his blue eyes intense with an emotion that made her breath catch. "Harriet," he said, her name almost a sigh. "I've tried to be patient, to give you the time you need, but tonight, seeing you with Billy, the way you knew exactly what he needed to hear, I find my patience wearing thin." He took a step toward her, then another, until he stood directly before her. "I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "I think I have been since the moment I saw you at Mrs. Wilson's dinner table, holding that tear-stained letter and looking as if the world had ended." Harriet's heart raced. "Marshall, you don't have to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I just needed you to know. Whatever you decide, whenever you decide it, my feelings won't change." In the darkness, his honesty gave her courage. "The letter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was from Thomas, my fiancé, his last letter before he died. I've carried it with me for nearly 2 years, reading it again and again, holding on to the grief because it felt like the only thing I had left of him." Marshall remained silent, allowing her to continue at her own pace. "But these past weeks," Harriet went on, "I've found myself reaching for it less often, and when I do read it, it's different. I see it now for what it is, a beautiful memory, but a memory nonetheless, not my future." She reached out, finding his hand in the darkness. "You asked for my permission to court me. I'm giving it now, Marshall. More than that, I think I'm falling in love with you too." The next flash of lightning illuminated his face, the hope, the joy, the tenderness there taking her breath away. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent shivers up her arm. "May I kiss you, Harriet Jenkins?" he asked, his voice husky. In answer, she rose on her tiptoes, her free hand finding the solid warmth of his chest for balance. Their lips met tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as they learned each other. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, while her hands slid up to his shoulders, feeling the strength there. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. Marshall rested his forehead against hers, his hand still at her waist. "I should go," he murmured, though he made no move to release her. "Before I forget every lesson in propriety my mother ever taught me." Harriet laughed softly, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Yes, you probably should." He kissed her once more, briefly but with no less intensity, then stepped back. "We'll talk more in the morning about Billy, about us, about everything." After he left, Harriet stood in the darkness for a long moment, her fingers touching her lips where the warmth of his kiss still lingered. For the first time in nearly 2 years, she felt truly alive, as if a weight she hadn't fully recognized had been lifted from her shoulders. The storm continued outside, but within Harriet's heart, a different kind of tempest had been calmed. Morning brought clear skies and the cheerful chirping of birds after the storm. Harriet dressed in her own clothes, now dried and pressed thanks to Mrs. Reynolds, and made her way to the dining room where Marshall and Billy were already at breakfast. "Good morning," Marshall said, rising as she entered. His eyes held a warmth that made her blush, remembering their encounter the previous night. "Miss Jenkins," Billy exclaimed, his usual sullenness replaced by genuine enthusiasm. "Mr. Matthews says I can stay here and learn about ranching." "And still go to school," he added quickly, clearly expecting this to be important to her. "That sounds wonderful, Billy," Harriet said, taking the seat Marshall held for her. "If that's what you want." "It's better than going back to Pa," the boy said, his expression darkening momentarily before brightening again. "And Mr. Matthews says I can have my own horse once I learn to care for it proper." Over breakfast, Marshall explained the plan he'd devised. He would speak to the judge about obtaining temporary guardianship of Billy, with the possibility of a more permanent arrangement depending on how things progressed. The boy would live at the ranch, help with age-appropriate tasks, and continue his education at Harriet's school. "If you're agreeable," Marshall said to Harriet, "I thought you might help Billy catch up on the schoolwork he's missed during your Saturday sessions. I'd compensate you for the extra time, of course." "That won't be necessary," Harriet replied. "I'd be happy to help Billy." The boy looked between them, his shrewd eyes missing nothing. "Are you two sweet on each other?" he asked bluntly. Marshall choked on his coffee while Harriet felt her face flush crimson. "Billy, that's not an appropriate question," she managed to say. "Why not?" "Everyone in town's been talking about it for weeks. Mrs. Wilson told Mrs. Cooper, who told Mrs. Reynolds that you two were likely to announce your engagement any day now." "Did she indeed?" Marshall said, recovering his composure and casting an amused glance at his housekeeper, who suddenly became very interested in refilling the coffee cups. "Well, if you must know, Billy," Marshall continued, his eyes meeting Harriet's with a question in them, "Miss Jenkins has agreed to allow me to court her. As for engagements, we'll see what the future holds." After breakfast, Marshall drove Harriet and Billy back to town in the buggy. Billy was dropped off at the sheriff's office, where arrangements would be made for collecting his belongings from his father's house under supervision. Alone with Harriet as they approached the schoolhouse, Marshall's manner grew more serious. "I meant what I said at breakfast," he told her, "about seeing what the future holds. I don't want to rush you, Harriet. Last night was, well, it was a night of high emotion for all of us. If you've had second thoughts in the light of day, I haven't," she interrupted, placing her hand on his arm. "Not about my feelings for you, at least." Relief washed over his face. "Good, because I'd like to do this properly." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, holding it out to her. "This belonged to my mother. I'd be honored if you'd wear it." It was a ring, a delicate band of gold set with a small but perfect sapphire that matched the blue of his eyes. "Marshall," Harriet breathed, "it's beautiful." "It's not an engagement ring," he hastened to clarify. "Not unless you want it to be. Think of it as a promise that I'll wait until you're ready, however long that takes." Harriet looked at the ring, then at the man offering it, this strong, kind man who had shown her that life could hold joy again. That love wasn't a once-in-a-lifetime chance, but a gift that could be given more than once. "I don't think it will take very long," she said softly, holding out her left hand. Marshall's smile was brilliant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles just above the ring. "I love you, Harriet Jenkins," he said, his blue eyes holding hers. "I think I've loved you since I saw you holding that letter, looking so brave despite your sorrow." "I love you too," she replied, the words feeling both strange and right on her tongue. "And I'm ready to let go of the past. To build a future with you." He leaned across the seat of the buggy, cupping her cheek with his hand as he kissed her tenderly. It was a kiss of promise, of commitment, of a love that had grown slowly but steadily over the months since her arrival in Silverleaf. When they parted, Harriet's hand went instinctively to her reticule, where for nearly 2 years she had carried Thomas's letter. But today, for the first time, it wasn't there. She had left it in the drawer at the schoolhouse, a deliberate choice to stop carrying the weight of her grief. Marshall noticed the gesture and seemed to understand its significance. "I can't replace what you lost, Harriet," he said gently. "I wouldn't want to try, but I promise to write you something better than that tear-stained letter, a story of joy, of family, of a life built together." Harriet smiled through the tears that had sprung to her eyes, not tears of sorrow this time, but of hope. "I'd like that very much," she said, taking his hand in hers, the sapphire ring catching the morning sunlight and sending blue sparks dancing between them, a promise of the bright future to come.